Hi, I'm Luna, and in my previous video, I went through specifically certain areas that have already been covered in the Pokemon universe as Regent. However, at the same time, there is one thing, or rather one place, that I left out, specifically because the answer is not as clear. Being, where's Kitakami? Now, it's clearly in the Japan-inspired area of the Pokemon world because, I mean, it's literally named Kitakami. Its entire legendary theming is based off of the tale of Momotaro. This is inherently a Japanese area. So, before we get into it, of course you heard this a million times before, but how channels grow is with the comments, the likes, and the subscribing. If you like to hear my thoughts, if you like my sort of logic and my theories, subscribe and comment, let me know what you like, what you dislike, how I can improve, because I'm just a small channel. And really, I don't really have the audience yet to have that sort of feedback. And as a data scientist on my end, that's where data is what I look for. So if you see this, even if you don't want to watch the whole thing, but wants to tell me a couple of ways I can improve, go ahead, let me know. I mean, I'm literally recording in my closet right now for sound and light. Let me know if that's bad or good compared to previous ones. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go into Kitakami. Now, there's actually two answers I can give. A boring one, and a more interesting. Let's start with the boring one. Right there. And that is for a reason. This is the map of Japan. Right there is Kitakami. A literal place in Japan called Kitakami. That's also why it's the boring answer. Because, of course, a literal place called Kitakami, right there, would the Pokemon Company do that? I mean, it would require a bunch of jumps in logic. But first let me spell it out. This is the kanji they use. Ugh. Kitakami. Don't mind the paint, because paint is more difficult with a trackpad. But people who know these characters know that that literally says north up. And assuming those are the same characters they're going to use for Kitakami, north up, that essentially blocks out this part here. Even if we can keep the boring one in mind, even if we ignore it, this area is going to be eliminated. Firstly, because of course, north up. And secondly, the Pokemon Ursaluna in its Blood Moon form is here. It would be too much of a stretch to think that... I'll use green for Ursaluna. Ursaluna came from this little swampy area, the only real place where you can find the peat in order to evolve it, and went all the way here. That's too big of a jump in logic. So even if we don't consider the north up, Ursaluna is enough to tell us that we're not looking at down here. Now, of course, we could consider rafting down to real-world Kitakami. That's also a little bit of a stretch in itself. I mean, in fact, if we consider Pecharunt's journey described by the Pokemon Company themselves, it comes from a clearly Japanese area in which, in early days before the actual Empire of Japan was only this here. That's where the people lived. And based off of the context clues and the sort of storytelling within Pecharunt's story, we have to know that it is from that area because it includes the old Japanese style, not just in its animation, but in its clothing. To the point where, since the entire point of the Empire of Japan was a sort of, I'll call it anger, with Commodore Matthew Perry for opening the doors and letting Japan back into the modern sphere, showing them radios, giving them modern clothing, whatnot. We have to go based off of the fact that that hasn't happened, and they aren't using the more modern clothing to know that the normal Japanese expansion northward from here hasn't really happened yet. Another point to consider is Pecharunt and Ogerpon specifically being an ogre. And that's enough said to say that we're dealing, sadly, with Ainu people here. Because they were truly otherized. They were considered something to go against until relatively recently. I implore you to do more research on the Ainu people. But that connection alone is enough to make me say we're dealing with Ainu territory. Which, just for reference, came down about here. That's also why the reason I'm not gonna go too deeply into it, because it's not on me, but the experiences of the Ainu people into my own work like that. I'm not gonna try and trample over their history in this sort of format. Now, on top of that, there's actually one other factor in Pecharunt's reveal video that I have to show in order to discuss. And that's here on the Pokemon's YouTube channel. Starting at around 2 minutes and 24 seconds in.
They crossed fields, mountains, and seas until Pecharunt and its retainers arrived in the land of Kitakami.
The important point being seas. Now, considering Japanese geography, they were said to have gone through fields, mountains, seas. Now I'll use this brown for the mountains. There's mountains along here. Mountains starting a little bit below Aomori. Going along like this. Though specifically there's a little less in two specific areas here. I'll use this lighter green for field. The Tokyo Plain and the Hokkaido-Osaka Plains here. these are the biggest fields that they could be talking about. There are fields along more of the coastlines, but the various mountainous areas of Japan put these two as the biggest points where there are minimal mountainous area and thus fields could grow. In fact, that tells me more that purple for Pecharunt. Pecharunt likely started around here, considering that the Tokyo or Edo area historically was considered a bunch of hicks, so to speak. And with the Pecharunt video showcasing more of a, urbanized Kyoto-style abode, it necessarily has to start here in my mind. Now, of course, this allows for fields and mountains to be crossed really easily based off the geography. But seas? If we're going to say that actual world Kitakami is where Kitakami is, in order to cross seas, they'd have to do something like that. Instead of doing the smart way, going through the Edo plain and up through the mountains. That is a bit too much of a stretch to say that this point is where we're going when discussing crossing seas. Instead, fields, mountains, and seas. That's why I believe, back to orange, that Kitakami is actually about right here, just outside of Hisu, or Seno. You see, Pecharunt crossing sea, that's the only real way it would make sense with the way it's presented. On top of that, it would put less of a stretch in terms of the area that Ursaluna has to cross, instead just being right there, sort of wandering the nearby forests and into Mount Coronet to a protected area where it could continue to live, even if the area around it sorta didn't make for a good area for overall Ursaluna to thrive, hence why it died off. And there's actually one other factor I would like to bring up, and that's White-Stripe Basculin. Now there are a couple of places where we see it. Cobalt Coastlands, never say that right, in the lower rivers of the Coronet Highlands, and the Alabaster Ice Set. Equating those areas to this map, we know they existed here, here, and down through here. Those are the only places we know that they exist. Except for in the timeless woods area of Kitakami, or where I would place it on this if following my Kitakami interpretation, it would just come down from the Coronet Highlands area, where we know they already existed. And of course, it would not make sense for the White-Stripe Basculin, based off of what we know about it, to be all the way down at real world Kitakami, but there was no point where we knew they swam out far to sea. In fact, they seemed to stay pretty local. With the Cobalt Coastland, it was very, very close to the general coastline. And otherwise, it was just in the rivers. This is too far away from mainland Honshu or this big section here to really make sense to be in Kitakami, unless Kitakami was connected to the Coronet Highlands, i.e. right here, in the Timeless Woods, thus connecting to that through the river system. And that also makes, of course, Ursaluna makes sense. It makes Pecharunt's story make sense of having to cross over the seas. Really, it's the only place that makes sense, in my opinion, for where it can be. Which is also interesting, because of course we see Perrin there. We see that it's less of a snowy area as well, which would make sense considering how in Japan the winds that bring the snow come from this direction from China. Some of the most snow in the world happen through here and here, because those sections specifically are not well blocked out by the mountain. But even going as low as Kyoto, they still get some snow. Tokyo doesn't really. Sendai doesn't as much. It starts to get more because it heads north. And the points that have the most snow in the world are through here. Which makes a little less sense if Kitakami were down on Honshu instead of being straight up protected by Mount Coronet. Now, I hope that made any sense. The map has clearly been blocked out, but this is why I think Kitakami can only be right on the bottom, just outside of where we normally see in Sinnoh and Hisui. Let me know what you think, leave your comments below, and I hope that made you think a little.